Hello everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel called Living in Hayward, Wisconsin, where we talk about all things real estate related and also about living in Hayward. I'm Audrey Miller. I'm the broker owner of Northwest Wisconsin Realty Team. I am a listing and lakefront expert, so I'm happy to help you with any of your buying, selling, things that you just want to know about the area. All of that I'm here to help with. So happy to be a resource or to assist you with all of your real estate needs. If you'll notice, I have done a lot of my videos over the last year and a half from this home office / library that I have. And so I've gotten you a change of scenery over here. I organized my library just last week as things get a little bit slower in the fall. I had a few spare minutes. So I have organized it into fiction and nonfiction, and then by subject in the fiction area and by author last name in the, by author last name in the fiction area and by subject in the nonfiction area. I have loved to read ever since I learned to read as a young girl, and I've always loved books, and I've accumulated a library of about 1,000 books over the years. And I was having trouble finding books within my own library when I wanted to find them because they were not organized other than by size. So I'm really happy with this project, but in the end, you get a little bit different view of the bookshelf behind me if you ever paid attention to that in the past. So anyway, that was a little bit of a squirrel moment, but today we're going to talk about DNR regulations regarding shorelines, setbacks, the buffer zone, which has to do with how much you can clear when you purchase a lakefront property, wetlands, docks, and rules of surrounding dock and pier installations, weed removal from the lakes, all of these things questions that come up a lot in my work. And the rules are actually pretty easy to define and are fairly cut and dried. And as far as I know, Sawyer County follows the DNR's rules, so they don't really have a lot of rules that are different from what the DNR, which stands for Department of Natural Resources, has dictated and mandated within our area. Now, as always, do not take me as the sole expert or source of information on this. I do not work for the county. I do not work for the DNR. So while I have knowledge of this, and I'm going to show you screenshots from the DNR government site during this video, if you have questions, please contact Sawyer County or Washburn County or Bayfield County zoning, and also feel free to reach out to a local Wisconsin DNR or someone from Madison potentially with the DNR who can answer questions that you may have. So anyway, let's get started on this, and hopefully you'll find this information to be helpful. So first of all, what is shoreland zoning? I'll just read this little description to you. So in Wisconsin, shoreland zoning refers to regulations managed by counties and mandated by the Wisconsin DNR that control land use and development within a specific distance of lakes, rivers, and streams. And the purpose of this is to protect water quality and habitat. The zone typically extends 1,000 feet from the ordinary high water mark of a lake, pond, or flowage, and 300 feet from a river or stream, or to the edge of the floodplain, whichever is further. So this means anything that is either in direct contact with the water or within a certain distance from the water would be subject to shoreland zoning regulations. But where we typically see this actually in effect is on properties with direct riverfront or lakefront property. That's where we typically run into this the most. So I'm going to start with talking about the buffer zone. The buffer zone has to do with the vegetation and trees that are on the shoreline on the ground, not in the water. This is separate from that. So, you have bushes, you have trees, you have vegetation, all of that along the shorelines of our lakes and rivers. The buffer zone is the area that is 35 feet from the ordinary high water mark. So the ordinary high water mark can typically be seen with anyone can kind of see where it is just by visually looking. Sometimes the DNR comes and marks that, but really it's pretty easy to define the ordinary high water mark. Like at the moment in 2025, our lakes and rivers are down just a little bit due to a few years of less rain and less snow, but you'll be able to see where there's no trees or vegetation growing. You can usually kind of see a little bank of sorts. Even with level elevation, there's like a place where you can tell that the water has come to that point in the past repeatedly. There's often a little shelf there. Even if the water is down a bit at the moment, you can tell typically where the ordinary high water mark is. So from there, 35 feet back is what is this buffer zone. If you get past 35 feet from the ordinary high water mark, then you can do a lot more clearing. Actually, there's really not rules about it after you get back there. It's kind of up to your preference. Also, none of these rules apply to off-water property. In the counties around us, if you wanted to take down every tree and bush on your land and turn it into a field, now you may have to look at zoning if it's not zoned agricultural as far as what you can grow there. But if you wanted to clear it and make it a huge yard that was 3 acres large, you could do that without restrictions. But this has to do with the, properties that are adjacent to or within the regulations of the shoreline zoning. So within that buffer zone, you are able to clear 30% of your frontage. So let's say the typical lot is 100 feet wide. You could completely clear all vegetation and trees down to the water's edge up to 33 feet, which would be 30% of your shoreline. If you have more shoreline, you can still clear 30% up to a maximum of 200 feet. So let's say you somehow came upon a property that had 1,000 feet of shoreline. That typically wouldn't happen on the larger lakes, but you could find that maybe once in a while on a smaller lake. Then you would be able to clear up to 200 feet maximum, even though your third would be more than that. And that cleared frontage does not have to be adjacent to the other portion of your cleared frontage. So let's say you want to do 100 feet in front of your cabin, and then you wanted to do your other 100 feet, a little ways down the shoreline for some reason. You could clear 2 spots. The same thing applies. Let's say you ended up buying a lot with 150 feet of frontage. 1/3 of that frontage is around 50 feet. You could have 25 feet of that in one place, 25 feet of that in another place for a viewing corridor, or it can be together. So that's kind of how that part works. And sometimes people choose to leave more of their trees and vegetation, or they just cut some of the lower branches and they're good with that view and they want the privacy so people can't see into their property as much. Of course, that's totally fine. But let's say you purchase a property like that, you are welcome to clear more trees without a permit if it is within these regulations that I just mentioned. So you can cut them down yourself, you can hire a tree company, whatever you want to do. But you are allowed to clear up to 30% of your frontage or up to 200 feet maximum completely. So it's preference beyond that if you'd like to leave more trees or not for your own privacy or the feel that you like to have from your lake or riverfront property. So the next question that gets asked a lot is about setbacks. So this is if you're buying vacant land or maybe looking to add on to an existing cabin that you bought or lake home, or you want to rebuild, any of that. Setbacks from the water in the shoreline zoning areas are currently 75 feet. So you cannot build any home, cabin, your main structure has to be 75 feet back from the water. There are some exceptions for movable structures like a gazebo or maybe like a fire pit or patio area. I believe those have to be 35 feet back, but your main structure needs to be 75 feet back from the water. Now, in the past, in our area, there has been times a long time ago when there was no setback required or very minimal, maybe 10 feet. And then there was a period of time where the setback was 35 feet. So you will find a lot of these cool properties where the buildings are grandfathered in proximity to the water. And that's kind of a neat feature because you can't build that close any longer. However, if you say bought a real small 24 by 24 cabin and it was grandfathered in at 35 feet back from the water, you should be able to go up with a second story if there isn't a second story, but you won't be able to add on to the back or the sides of that because your addition would not be 75 feet back from the water. You'd only be 59 feet back from the water at the back of your cabin. Now, let's say you bought something that was set back 50 feet from the water and the building was 30 feet deep, then you would have the ability to add on to the back because you now meet the 75-foot setback for any addition to the cabin or house or whatever you're doing. Same thing if you were to tear it down and rebuild. There's regulations around that from zoning in general, and obviously you need to get building permits and all of that. But the same rules would apply if you were to rebuild on the lot. You have to be at the current 75-foot setback. So sometimes people choose to fix up or maybe add a second story to something that's grandfathered in so that they can maintain their proximity to the water, which is kind of a rare thing to come across with our new setbacks that have been in place for quite a long time now. And then the other rule that applies to the shoreline zoning areas and is a DNR rule has to do with impervious surfaces. And again, this does not apply to off-water or non-shoreline zoning. So on a lake or riverfront lot, you can only have up to 15% of your total land area covered by structures. And structures can include your cabin, a deck, maybe even a concrete pad that's in front of your garage. Any of those things would be considered structures on the property. So if you have a really small lot, the only time this really comes into play very much is if you have maybe just barely a half-acre lot and you've got a large house on it and you've got a garage, you could bump up against the impervious surfaces rule. So you can't just fill your entire lot with buildings when you're on lakefront. You have to leave some green space, I'll call it. Only 15% of your lot can be filled with buildings. So that's something to keep in mind as well. These are the questions that come up a lot. Oh, I wanted to mention one thing with the setbacks. If you have wetlands that adjoin the lake at the edge of your property, there's going to be additional setback from the wetland, not just from the ordinary high water mark. When a wetland is directly adjacent to the navigable water, the setback from the wetland is 75 feet, even if you're now 100 feet from the water, if that makes sense. Hopefully you can follow all all of this. But if it's just strictly a wetland and it's not shoreline zoning, then the setback is 40 feet. But for wetlands that are adjacent to the navigable water, your setback from the edge of the wetland is then 75 feet. So the county is extremely helpful with all of this. People typically go to Sawyer County zoning and speak to someone there versus trying to reach out to a contact at the DNR. The Sawyer County zoning folks are very familiar with the DNR regulations, and they can kind of explain them to you in layman's terms, just like I'm doing now. There are some nuances to this. So I'm, not saying that every case will fit this, but these are the broad overviews that are pretty much blanket across the board rules set by the DNR. And there's not a lot of variation from this. Maybe sometimes you can get a conditional use permit or a special permit, but typically people just kind of work within these regulations. Sometimes we'll look at a property that has some wetlands adjacent to the water, and people will ask me, can I just fill this in? Can I bring in sand or can I bring in dirt and fill in this wetland? No, you cannot. For sure not without a special permit, which I doubt they would be likely to grant. The wetlands are protected and you're not allowed to typically mess with them, fill them in, any of that. You have to kind of leave them be and be set back from them accordingly. But another question I get a lot has to do with weed removal within the water. And I'll show you this document from the Wisconsin DNR. It's kind of their code, I guess you'd call it. You can find this online. So they do allow for native aquatic species to be removed without a permit within 30 feet width in the water where your dock is. So let's say you have your dock and then you can make a swimming area. So you can do 30 feet of width, including the width of your dock. And what I've heard, I don't see it in this document, but what I believe I was told was up to chest height. So let's say you've got some reeds or lily pads or other grasses that are growing on your shoreline, but you've got a nice sandy bottom and you want to make a swimming area. You can make that 30 feet wide. Your dock would be in that same space, but you could do 30 feet wide, which would still allow for a nice swimming area on one side of your dock or the other, and then out to the depth of chest height. I find that kind of funny because people vary in height, so chest height is sort of a, on a sliding scale. But anyway, that's the rule about removing weeds within the water. Anything beyond that, you would need to have a special permit. And then let's talk about docks for just a little bit. There's a whole pier installation guide that you can find online. It's pretty clear, I feel, on what you can do for docks. Sometimes there's special things that apply if there's vegetation in the water, but typically these are the rules related to pier and dock installations, how many you can have, and all of that. So yes, this pier planner document is very, very helpful. So I would suggest just downloading and reading this. And if you need clarification, then reach out to the Department of Natural Resources. But basically, the number of boat slips, total of all watercraft docked at a pier or a wharf, including boats in a boat lift or hoist, is limited to 2 boat slips for the first 50 feet of the owner's shoreline frontage, and then no more than 1 boat slip for each additional full 50 feet. The way that I interpret this is that if you have your typical 100 feet of frontage, you can have 1 dock with 2 boat slips on it. You need to have 101 feet to be able to put in that second dock. I am pretty certain that that's how that's interpreted. But let's say you have 150 feet of frontage, you could do a dock with 2 slips, and then you could do another dock with 1 boat slip and keep 3 boats at your property in a case like that. But typically it's just the 2 boat slips. So it's not talking about docks, it's talking about how many boats you can have moored there. And then in addition to the boat slip allowance, you can secure up to 2 personal watercraft for the first 50 feet of the owner's shoreline frontage and 1 additional personal watercraft, so like jet skis, for example, for each additional full 50 feet of shoreline. Your pier or wharf can't obstruct navigation. So like in a riverfront, you can't put your pier the whole way out across the water that nobody can get through, and it can't harm the public interest, etc. And then there's a lot of other little information and rules about this in this pier planner that might be helpful, but that's the basic guidelines. Now, if your dock has been in use for consecutive years, I can't remember, maybe 10 consecutive years, and you can provide proof of that, it can be grandfathered in, because again, these rules are different than they were in the past. So if it's grandfathered in and you can show that it's been used for this length of time that they require, then you can leave it there as a grandfathered in situation, but you wouldn't be able to buy a property that didn't have the docks grandfathered in beyond what the current regulations are. So these are just some of the main questions that I get, and I'm actually often surprised a lot of people don't know many of these rules. And like I said, they're pretty consistent across the board and fairly easy to understand, in my opinion. Obviously, when you're looking at property with me, I can fill you in on all of this, but maybe there's times I'm not the one you're working with, or just you're looking to buy property and thinking about these things and want to know, can I do this or that? This gives you an overview of all of those things, and hopefully is helpful in your thought processes regarding a piece of land you might want to purchase or a home that you want to purchase, and what you can do with it after you are the owner. Again, I'm Audrey Miller. Contact me anytime. I love hearing from my viewers. If you have something you'd like me to talk about, if you have a comment, maybe something you think I could improve upon, let me know, and I'd be happy to hear from you.